Hi, it's John, and today we're going to take a look at the Nikon 28mm f2.8 for the Z mount. I'm going to assess who this lens might be for, and I'll share photos I've taken with the lens, as well as reviewing the sharpness of the lens compared to the 24-70 f4 Z mount zoom. So the lens was released in June 2021 as the special edition version. It's optically the same as the non-SE version, but it is $10 more expensive, and you'll get more of a retro vibe for your $10 extra. The optical design and size were essentially a blueprint for the 40mm f2, which followed in September 2021. They share a very similar design aesthetically and functionally, though the 40mm maximum aperture is a stop wider at f2. So let's get into the design and build quality. If you've watched my review of the 40mm f2, then you already know what I'm going to say. The lens is constructed of polycarbonate all the way to the lens mount. Given the weight of the lens, the lack of a metal mount isn't a practical issue. It's definitely not a premium build, but I think in practice the lens is tightly constructed and handles everyday use well. So while it would be nice to have a lower profile pancake lens, the size of the lens was a known quantity before I bought it. And like the 40mm f2, I miss having a manual focus switch on the side of the lens. While Nikon's implementation of manual focus override is cleverly done, there are times when you just want to go full manual focus. A manual focus switch right next to the focus ring would help in those occasions. Moving on to weather resistance, Nikon describes the weather ceiling in the lens as follows. I've not tested the lens in extreme weather, but it's been solidly reliable in light showers. Also, similar to the 40mm, the lens exhibits focus shift, meaning you may have to refocus after changing the aperture if you're shooting at narrow apertures. Let's take a look at how the lens performs for video work. The 28mm focuses fast and confidently and has a small amount of focus breathing. Unless you're racking from infinity to minimum focus distance, this will likely not be a big deal. Its small size works well on a compact gimbal, and it's easy to rig up for an overhead shot. But due to its wideish focal length and its mundane maximum aperture, subject separation is pretty limited. I've tested the autofocus noise using my Z6, and it's one of the quieter lenses I've tested. While you can still hear it in a quiet space, it's noticeably quieter than the 40mm f2, which itself was not a bad lens. Overall, I think you'll find this a solid lens for video work. Now let's look at the close focusing capabilities of the lens. Its minimum focusing distance is just 19 centimeters, though the magnification ratio isn't overly remarkable at just 0.2 times. I did a test shot around 20 centimeters to see how the image held up at close distance, and like its close relative, the 40mm f2, the image is pretty weak wide open and the corners are poor. This doesn't get much better as we stop down. But if we move out even just a little, to say around a foot, the image starts to look a lot better. These aren't typical shooting distances, so why don't we take a look at some shot at regular distances? So I went up to the Ulysses S. Grant Memorial on 125th and Riverside. It's a decent subject to test the sharpness of a wide-angled lens. So I put the Z8 on the tripod and leveled it so that the front facade of the building would be in focus. The only wrinkle with the memorial is that the front colonnade projects forward from the main structure, so I focused to the side of the columns to focus on the main part of the building. This allows us to look at the far corners, knowing they're in the same focal plane. On the screen are three images of the 28mm at apertures of f2.8, f4 and f5.6, along with the 24-70 f4 with an equivalent field of view and at f4. I know from extensive use of the lens that the center of the frame is nicely sharp. It's not going to challenge an S-line prime lens, but it's very usable. Stopping down to f4 or f5.6 helps tighten up, but even wide open, the center sharpness is good. But let's take a look at the corners, as this is where the 40mm f2 struggled. The mid-frame is a little less sharp than the 24-70 at all three apertures, but moving into the corner, it's very clear that the 24-70, even at f4, is significantly better than all three images from the 28mm. And at f2.8, it's pretty evident that the vignetting isn't fully corrected in the camera-produced JPEG. So if you're going to need good performance across the frame, the 28mm is not going to meet that requirement. The 24-70, albeit a stop slower, is already a decent performer at its maximum aperture of f4 and gets a little better by stopping down. Okay, let's look at the lens's handling of chromatic aberration and coma. While not as significant as the 40mm open-wide f2, both chromatic aberration and coma can be very visible with this lens. In this photo taken directly into the sun, the purple is very evident. You don't need to pixel peep to find this. This sequence starts with the lens wide open and then stop down to f11. The magenta is very evident wide open and decreases as we stop down, but is still observable in the f11 image. And the rendering wide open shows some obvious coma around specular highlights, which goes as we stop down to f4 and beyond. Just take some care shooting out of focus highlights wide open. Vignetting isn't something I generally comment on, as it's handled by applying lens corrections either in camera or in your editor of choice, so it's not usually a practical issue. But with the 28mm, the lens vignettes pretty hard, and the Nikon lens correction doesn't fully eliminate the light fall off in the corners of the image at f2.8. When we stop down to f4, lens corrections largely take care of the vignetting issue. So let's take a look at some images I've taken with the lens. Here are a few spring images in and around Riverside Park. And here are a handful of images taken around the High Line and Hudson Yards. It's an impressive development and a fun place to shoot your camera. And here are a couple from the Columbia University campus up at 116th Street. And finally, some from Lincoln Center.
So what are my overall thoughts on the 28mm f2.8? The lens is a solid, if unsophisticated lens.
The lens is pretty decent from an image quality perspective, except for the corners wide open, which exhibit strong vignetting, coma, and poor acuity. Stopping down to f4 and preferably 5.6 substantially cuts down on these limitations, though the corners never reach the performance wide open of the 24-70 f4 lens. Close focusing performance is not good and should only be used in a pinch. So let's take a look at some alternatives to the lens. The obvious comparison to make is with the Z 26mm f2.8 Pancake. Now that lens is pretty much twice the street price. While I've not tested that lens, it's reportedly sharp in the center, but weak wide open in the FX corners. If you want the smallest lens, the 26mm is the way to go. But if you don't mind a bigger, but still compact lens, I suspect you're not giving up a huge amount going with the 28mm f2.8. Then there's the 24-70 f4, which can be had second-hand for not much more than the retail price of the 28mm. It outperforms the 28 in many areas, with the exception of size, and while it's notionally a stop slower than the 28mm, image quality is pretty strong on the zoom from f4, so there's less need to stop down to get a decent result. Another comparison could be made with the 24mm f1.8, but with an MSRP of $1,000, it's not really a reasonable comparison to make. If you're shooting on a DX camera, the 24mm f1.7 DX lens makes a strong contender. Shooting the 28mm on a DX body largely eliminates the corner issues on the FX frame. But if you're only shooting on crop bodies, I'd just opt for the smaller and faster 24mm f1.7. But if you own FX and DX bodies, the 28mm makes more sense. So to answer the question of whether the lens is good enough, it naturally comes down to what lenses you already own and whether you really need a lens that is small and lighter than Nikon standard zooms. I find the 28mm the least compelling of Nikon's offerings, especially if you have one of Nikon's standard zooms. While it is smaller and cheaper than most of Nikon's lenses, you're not gaining the two stops of light gathering that you would with the 40mm f2. But if you're building a kit from scratch and don't intend to get one of Nikon's f4 standard zooms, then maybe the lens could grab a spot in your lineup if you're looking for a cheap and compact lens. If you already own a standard zoom, this lens is a harder sell. So that wraps up this video. If you have any questions or your own observations about this lens, it would be great to hear your thoughts. Thanks for checking out the video. If it's been helpful, please like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment below.